Well, it's Wednesday. How are you doing? How's things in your life? Trust it's all going better. You know, each day allows us the opportunity to change our reality. It's true. Even when I was a Christian, I knew the importance about getting up first thing in the morning and focusing in on that which is most important for me at back in that time was, what we call devotion time, which leads me to today's topic. It was not on my agenda. In fact, I was up most of the night going over some things that I have been reading and trying to put them in kind of a spatial orientation in my mind. But in the last, I don't know, 4 days, I've gotten a number of emails of people asking me, Wayne, are you a Christian? No, I'm not. I was at one time. But so I'm going to go ahead and address this for everyone so you know where I stand. I think ambiguity is the worst thing that any conscious, intelligent, sentient being can encounter because you're not sure of exactly what you're hearing. And that leads to, unfortunately, most of the time, uh, coming to false conclusions that the data was erroneous. Also, I want to kind of dedicate this to my friend Eric. Eric's been following me for a long time, and um, Eric's a good soul. I get to know some of you just by the emails, and you know, it's I know one day we will all meet soul to soul. So, why am I not a Christian? Listen, I got born again, quote unquote, right before I turned 13. And throughout my life, I had more than a few questions, like you do. It's early here, so I'm having my morning drink from my favorite coffee cup that is literally um, 18 years old. Yeah, I was part of the group that actually started the e-commerce back in the day. But back to the subject here. Throughout my walk in Christianity was one that was always left with ambiguity. There's questions we all have. The religion itself is designed that way. And let me state this right up front for you to ponder today. Why would God associate himself or limit itself with any one religion? Why would the infinite being even want to be part of a religion? You see, where I'm at today, and I'm very well satisfied with this, there's peace. As David wrote in the Psalms, Shelah. Because the God spell has been broken over my life. Now, whether you want to admit it or not, the second you become associated with a religion, you've been cast under a spell. It's how it works. So anyway, let me just give you a quote. Because as I said, I always had questions, and in fact, anyone in Christianity does. I think in any religion, as I study more and more, particularly in the origins, very fuzzy on the math. It is. But this is a great quote. Now, let me just tell you this as well. This is part of the God spell. every Christian is a part of the Catholic Church. The Great Schism of the 1500s that took place was just that. It was a schism. Because as the protesters left the Holy Church, they had to take with them the Holy Scriptures. Now, they had a different point of view, and that's where the Protestant Reformation started. For all of you who would like to have a little history and eschatology. So, no matter how you look at it, if you're a professing Christian, your heritage, your foundation, your DNA is in Rome. Plain and simple. Don't be trying to send me emails and trying to argue the point, because all I'm going to do is to direct you to a book that I read decades ago. I wish I had just been a bit more enlightened, called The Two Babylons, or The Papal Worship Proved to be the Worship of Nimrod. And by the way, we're going to be going through a lot of books. There you go, folks. Seriously, it's time for you to know what you're worshiping if you're a Christian. Listen, I could care less. I'm not here to proselytize anyone. We're all entitled to our beliefs. After all, I've told you this. The purpose of life is you. The reason for life is you. Why you're here is because of you. This is about your journey, your discovery. Now, however you add to your boat, that's up to you. I'm going to digress here. I was in the video industry, as you know. Anyone can check out my resume. It's on LinkedIn. For quite a few years, nearly 17 years. In the latter part of it, as technology began to erode the margins of our industry, I got involved in the duplication and fulfillment side of the video industry. Worked for one of the largest domestic duplicators. And one of my clients was the Smithsonian. Got to know Bob very well. He was the curator. And, part of our contract with the Smithsonian is that we had to meet quarterly. They would come down to the plant there in Tennessee, or I would fly up to Washington, D.C. Well, on one of those trips, Bob and I were going to meet for breakfast, and something came up. And so he said, well, what would you like to do? Is there anything I could, assist you with? And I said, yeah, really like to go through the National Gallery of Art. He says, what time do you want to be there? I said, is 6 o'clock too early? He says, no. So he called, made arrangements with the guards, and I got there I got there early, and they were waiting for me. Back in those days, we didn't quite have the computers that we do today, but still, I got my little badge, and the guard walked off, and he said, have fun. Gave me a flashlight, said some areas won't have the lights on, and showed me how to turn on the light panels. So here I am walking through the National Gallery of Art. Just me and a handful of security personnel. So as I'm walking, just admiring the collective consciousness of man, because that's what art is, folks. It's an expression of us. We just never see it. We look at the great masters, the Picassos, the Monets. I could just go off on a dozen more. And we marvel. I remember actually being in Andy Warhol's museum, and abstractional art. But you know something? That freaking Campbell's soup can is still burned into my consciousness. So it worked. The man was smart. He was onto something. But back to the National Gallery of Art. So as I'm walking through, right, I come to this huge mural, 3 of them. mounted on that. And it's called The Journey of a Warrior. And in the first mural, and these are big, there is paradise. There's a river flowing through, and there is this beautifully adorned raft. And it has a covering over it, and it's draped with curtains, and inside is a child. Now, all around the child are particular treasures. Now, I just wish like I said, had just been a tad more enlightened. Then in the second mural, the child is now in midlife fighting. You can see arrows coming in, and you can see that there's holes in his raft. In fact, the curtains are now torn, and he is trying apparently to keep the treasures, but he's losing them. And then the next scene in the third mural has the raft now heading to a glorious sunset. Or it could have been a sunrise. Not sure as I look at it now. And he's old. He's still proud. And he has new treasures. And it caught my attention. To this very day, I still meditate on that. Because there was the infinite being, or could I say, guardian spirits, trying to communicate to me about the real things about life. But I was young, I was foolish, I was all about going out and making the dollar. You know what I'm saying? So, my awakening from under the God spell started years ago. I just never realized it. And no matter how much I began to study, because here's the thing about it. If you're a knowledge seeker and you truly want to be honest with yourself, and you start looking within, really examining, put yourself on trial. You know, I heard the expression once. It says that if you were put on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence? Well, I would just say this. If you were put on trial as being honest with yourself, would there be enough evidence? So as I got older in life, you know, once you pass the age of 50, it's a mark, it's an accomplishment, half a century old. And now we look at things and realize they're 50 years is nothing. So I began to ask the serious questions. Now, one of those things is this: how well we know what a profitable superstition this fable of Christ, fable, F-A-B-L-E, has been for us. What a profitable superstition. You know who said that? One dude who would probably really know what the hell he was really talking about, Pope Leo X. Yeah, as I wrote to my friend today, the infinite being would not be associated with any religion. Particularly, and I know this seems hard to hear, but it's the truth. Particularly the one of Christianity. Christianity is built on the murder and the spilling of hundreds of millions of innocent souls. And while they were doing their conversion, they were burning records. Why would any religion want to burn records? Why would you want to destroy the past? What? Maybe because you want to be the only one that they can refer to? That's called casting a spell, folks. Besides the crime against humanity, and a crime it is. Listen, I've said this and I'll continue to say this. Any religion that requires one drop of human blood is not worthy of us. Not worthy of us. So, that came, by the way, from the book, The Bible Fraud. Okay? Now, I told my good friend today that when the spell finally broke over me is when I realized that I'd been praying to a deity that has no name. None. Gets worse. I was told that this Savior's name was Jesus Christ of Nazareth. All made up. Never was a person named Jesus Christ. And here's where the God spell begins to unwind. When you realize throughout history, when historians write records, particularly of a culture, they do not alter or change the name of that culture's deity. They don't. Only in Christianity. Do you not think, and here's where it begins to unravel, that this Jewish rabbi would have had a Christian name, an English name? No. Wouldn't they have known that at the very beginning? One would assume. And why did they change the name to begin with? Now, people come and challenge me and they say, well, Wayne, it's just the translation. No, it's not a translation. You don't have an understanding of the definition translation. It has nothing to do with, in this case, my first name is Robert. Now, in the Spanish tongue, it's Roberto. And it has a similar one in Italian and in German, etc., etc. And if you're going to follow that line of defense, then they should have changed every name in the Old Testament. Because I don't know about you, but when you get to the genealogy record, holy crap. I need a dictionary that will spell it and speak it. Speak and spell, right? So, what is the right word that they did? Well, actually, the word, oddly enough, is a word many of us don't know about. And that word is transposition. What that basically means, ladies and gentlemen, is that you take a name and you ignore it and you put your name to it. We're talking about a deity, right? The Son of God. And by the way, it's not S-O-N, it's S-U-N. Look at the Catholic Church. The symbolism is everywhere, folks. You've been deceived. I was deceived. So words are important. All right, when I figured that one out, I said, okay. I still wanted to hang on desperately. So my wife and I began to study. Did we ever study? We started getting into the history. So my first challenge to all those who are still believing, and this is what helped me begin to get an understanding, is the real history. There is a history that unfortunately doesn't jive with the story. So you need to definitely get your book. This is the complete works of Flavius Josephus. Notice the name Flavius, please. This is considered to be the best historical record. I question Mr. Josephus throughout this book. You know, he was a traitor, first of all. Yeah, he was a general. Then when Vespasian was about to him, he suddenly became a mystic. Talk about hitting the lottery. He said, well, Vespasian, I can tell you that within, I think it was like 3 months, 6 months, he said, you're going to become Caesar. Well, Vespasian was a general, and I won't fill in the details. You got to learn it. So Vespasian said, well, I'm going to tell you what, Jack. I am going to keep you alive. And if in this period of time your prophecy comes true, you'll be rewarded. Well, sure enough, Vespasian was called back to Rome and in fact was made Caesar. So, did I tell you Vespasian's family name? Have some of you figured it out? Flavius. Oh, coincidence? And gets even a little more chummy. Talk about nepotism. Now Josephus, he's now living on the emperor's palace grounds. Got his own villa. Doing good, man. He's walking around in the fine silks, man. Hey, listen, he's got his bodyguard. He's got his VIP access. That's what he was. He was also part of probably one of the greatest deceptions perpetrated on humanity. Folks, you've got to read history. Because if you don't, you're going to be played as a fool. As I said to you yesterday in the yesterday's show, here's the thing. What we're discovering now with ground penetrating radar, we have new isotopes that can really look deep and actually produce 3D models of what we're looking at. History is unraveling. At least the history that we know of. And the religions can't substantiate it. They didn't know that we would have this technology. So when Titus, and what he did in 69, actually it started about 67 AD with the siege of Jerusalem. They started to build a wall around Jerusalem. Now, if you've studied Hebraic history, you would know Nehemiah. Now, the great thing about Nehemiah was that he actually was a real person, actually did exist. There's a record of him. And it's not in the Jewish record. It's the Medo-Persians record. He was, in fact, the cupbearer to the king. So we get a really good description of what Nehemiah did in rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. Second time that Jerusalem had been destroyed. Now that was 26 miles, roughly, all the sheep gates by the time you lay it all out. So now let's go to 67 AD with General Titus. Now, Titus's dad is Emperor Caesar. Titus completed his father's work, did it very well. When the final siege took place of Jerusalem, when they sealed the wall in the last Passover and basically entrapped 1 million Jews inside Jerusalem, it got bad really quick. Got so bad, cannibalism broke out. Yeah. And when the fires were set, I don't know what it had to smell like, but it had to be terrible. So let's get to actual history now. Titus enters into the temple. By the way, when you read the works of Josephus, you're going to learn that ain't the only temple. There was actually another temple built Bet you didn't know about that one, did you? But anyway, let's focus in on what happened. So Titus, he already knew. They knew where to look for these sacred documents. You could say it was basically the soul of the Hebrews. Why? Because the Jews, like us, there was a betrayer. There's a betrayer amongst us, of our race, in our species. So the Romans, if you study actual Roman history, this is what you do when you conquer a people. You know how you conquer a people? You destroy their God. You take everything associated to their beliefs in deities or deity, polytheism, monotheism, whatever it may be, and you destroy it. But actually, the Romans learned from someone who was even smarter than them. Now, I'm still getting finished with Titus as he goes into the temple. But the Romans actually learned, and their work was made much easier. And listen, the Jews were a pain in the ass to the Romans. You want to talk about bloody battles? Today, we would call it ISIS on steroids, because we're not dealing in tens, hundreds. No, we're dealing in thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, in these what we would call rebel attacks that the Jews were constantly doing against the Romans. The pain in the ass for them. And what we're going to discover, many of the stories in the New Testament are merely a typology of the battle victories and exploits of Vespasian. But getting back to this point where the Romans learned from, Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great would come in and conquer a region, the first thing they did was Hellenize it. And in the case of Judea, Alexander the Great, in 333 BC, established 50 cities in Judea. These were Hellenistic points. They Hellenized the whole area. And the great thing about the Greek belief system is that you can keep your God. You can keep all your beliefs. But here's the thing. It's engrafted into theirs, and theirs is engrafted into yours. And literally, Christianity is nothing more than an amalgamation of many other Hellenistic religions and beliefs. So the Romans picked up. And what they do is that they take the documents. So here's Titus, goes in, defiles the temple. It was to mock the Jews. And they went in the same thing that we did in Operation Desert Storm. The elite guys went in before the assault ever happened, and they hit that museum of Baghdad. And whatever they left with, it was heavy, and there was a lot of it. Well, Romans did the same thing. In fact, no matter how you look at the battles of history, it's much akin to the same thing. That's what the Catholic Church did when they conquered the Mesoamericans. And they conquered them, the Spaniards, working with Rome. You destroy all the records. I told you what they did at Constantinople. Actually, that was the Muslims. Same MO. That's how you do it. So Titus goes in, gets the documents, takes them back to Rome. Now, I'm going to say this because history has proven this to be correct. Christianity was invented to be an insult and a disdain to the Jews. It was to always remind them. Because here's the thing, when they were inventing Christianity, they didn't have a God. The story isn't going to work unless you have a God. Well, they just so happened to have one of a conquered people. And as far as Israel was concerned, after 70 AD, folks, it was desolate. The Romans left no stone standing. So you got a God. And then the great deception is that you take the Hebraicness, the Judaism out, and the only way you do that is that you change the name. Now, we've talked about Josephus. Let me tell you how it was unraveling while I was still practicing. This book right here, The Search, an historical search for the historical Jesus. You can see Dr. Ron Charles. First of all, any book that claims to be an accurate account in search of the historical Jesus is a fraud. Got to start with the name, folks. So if you can't get the name right, it's going to be hard to get the rest of the details. However, let me say something about Dr. Charles here. He actually did a damn good job. What I was surprised about is that in his conclusions, he still, after he found the evidence, couldn't accept the fact of the name. But along his discovery, let's take the Gospel of Mark. Who do you think wrote the Gospel of Mark? Well, Mark did. Well, Mark who? The Mark that supposedly followed the Messiah? No. Was it John Mark? The one that went with Paul and Barnabas? Well, as it turns out, no one named Mark ever wrote anything. At best, it was an outline by, and here again, we get the names, supposedly, the half-brother of Jesus. Now, that just goes against Catholicism because, remember, the problem with modern-day religions, all of them, as far as I can see, I don't see where the feminine is brought out. You got the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, what the hell is the mother? I mean, come on. Oh, we're going to give you Mary. Well, then that blows it because apparently she had coitus with Joseph and produced brothers and sisters. Well, that gets the whole holiness out of that situation. But as best as it can be determined, it was an outline by James. And people begin to fill it in. The problem is that also when you look at the chronology of when the writing supposedly took place, it's after the Pauline letters. Well, that's ass backwards. And here was the other thing. Let me ask you, were the people of the first century literate? I mean, could they read and write? Well, here's something I bet you didn't know. Do you know why Rome, besides the fact that Jerusalem was the crossroads of the Silk Road in trading into Europe from the East? But the interesting thing about the Herodians, oh, Herod, yes. You know, there was never no census, right? Never happened. But let's just say something about Herod. The Herodian family, and Bernice particularly, were brilliant, smart. And the reason why Rome so valued the territory of Judea was because Herod had the most literate and educated population, even more than Rome. Herod had the law of the king's decree. You went to school starting at the age of 5, and you left school at the age of 17. So all these people that we hear about that were around Jesus, and it can't even be Yeshua. I mean, I'm not even going to get into that. They were literate. They could read and write, which begs the question, if in fact these people were seeing what we were told they were seeing, why no other writings? Oh, you're going to say the Gnostics? Well, maybe. I don't know. It's just one of those things that this book, Dr. Charles, brings out very well. Yeah. So you have one of the most literate populations, but yet no writings, no records. That was the other problem. There are no records. There's no records of any crucifixion except for Ebenezer's in 69 AD, the one that Titus crucified. Records of that. But no records of anyone being crucified in 33, 34, 35 AD. None. There's no records in Herod's court of any such incidences. There's no record in any Jewish document. And the problem is that really when you look at the documents, outside if you want to talk about Paul, I think Paul was a fraud. I think he was starting his own religion, and he did a good job. And then that's the problem. When you put the Gospels and the Pauline letters together, they don't adhere to each other. Actually, they buffet each other. So when I discovered that, I said, well, this isn't making any sense. So it causes you to search more, right? And you do. So the first thing you have to realize is you have to go back. And this is a great book called, as you can see, the Yahweh Wars. How do I say this? The ancient Hebrews, Moshe, who, when they were putting their Bible together, called Moses. See, now why is that? Why is it that they can't even get the right name, even with Moses? But if you wanted to really be frank, that's a translation. Moshe, Moses, you see? But you don't understand who these renegades were. Do you really think that there was 1 million people out in the Sinai desert for 40 years? You really think that? 1 million people. That'd be like emptying the city of Nashville. You really think that? Because if you just start doing the logistics, it's weird. But I am convinced that there was a group out there. And I think that how we begin to get into this story gets really interesting. But going back, you look at the history of this, what you find out, ladies and gentlemen, that the time that supposedly Jacob's sons, Joseph and his brothers, sojourned in Egypt was 490 years. Do you know how long it takes to assimilate a people, a culture? No, number one, they didn't have one to begin with. If you accept the story, they were nomadics. And apparently they didn't have anything written, at least not anything that we know of. So first of all, how did they have a culture? I mean, seriously. They had a clan. which later became a tribe. My point is, it takes 2 generations, folks. 2. And then after that, the assimilation almost becomes complete. So we're talking 490 years here, nearly 500 years. What do you think their beliefs were based on? Could it have been what they're saying with Abraham? But if you really study Abraham, you find out that it's most likely whatever God approached Abraham was Sumerian, ancient Mesopotamian. So which gods do you think, for those nearly 500 years, those people were studying and learning about? Right, the Egyptian gods. The whole thing, you can have a belief system. You can have a race of people within a race. We see that already. See that, if I was to go over and visit, say, I'm trying to think, so I'm really getting to this point. Well, if you were to drop my butt into Siberia, I mean, I wouldn't know the language, wouldn't know the customs. So you can see how they could build a culture within themselves, but at the level of which we have been led to believe, no. And this book, by the way, really brings that out. So now we begin to see we have some real issues here. Now, I often found it interesting with the Nag Hammadi. They have a little different take on some things. And I find it fascinating that when you read, for instance, the second revelation of James, something's wrong here. I mean, the holy book of the great invisible spirit. You ought to read that. So, was there a Christ? I think there was. But I don't believe that the Christ associated itself or himself in whatever form that it took with any particular religion. Now, it could be that this was, again, maybe one of the many messiahs that Israel had at that time. And there were a lot of them, and they had a lot of followers. And they all reported them doing miracles. Now, some of them were just absolutely just, psychopaths. I mean, they were there for political purpose, and it was to spill as much Roman blood as they could, and subsequently of their own people. So that begins to get kind of odd, doesn't it? But I didn't want to stop there. As I began to look at this more and more, I started searching more and more. So I wanted to find someone else's take on it. And I did. All coming to some disturbing conclusions. Something ain't right. And the more you examine these books that have been canonized, you're shaking your head because it doesn't make sense. The book of Hebrews is always one that, as I look at it now, is a mystic book. I mean, you're trying to blend Kabbalism into Christianity and Judaism. It doesn't work that way. But by the time you get finished with it, you become convinced that it's the gospel. It's not. This is a good book. You need to get it. Validates. And these people are not into it. These are independent researchers. So I got, okay, what do we do with this now? I mean, come on, the story is getting kind of weird. So when I told you to get this book, you're going to find out how much Christianity is really based in some, how shall we say, ancient Sumerian beliefs. So I wanted to find a little bit more about the cats who start writing about it. Get ready. So I recommend everyone buy, or you can actually go on YouTube and you can see the complete videos. They actually do it in video format. You see, folks, when Titus went back and his dad died, Vespasian, Titus petitioned the Senate to elevate his father to Caesar. He was emperor, but to Caesar, that opened high. They did. They voted him as God. That made Titus the son of God. Determine for yourself, but read, study. You can question, that's fine. But read. That's what I'm trying to say. Form your own independent conclusions based on the fact, not the fable. That's all I'm saying. Because then you can get into books like this one. I recommend this book. It is a great book. Everything, and you know, mine is marked up, got different points in it. But what David Fitzgerald did here was wonderful. Folks, the deception is so, here's my point. You get opened up, particularly in the book of the Gospel of John, right? You get introduced to this whole background of John the Baptist, right? Baptized Jesus in the Jordan. Holy Spirit came down, descended upon him as a dove. Baptism is not part of Judaism, not in any shape, form, or fashion. If you had someone called John the Baptist, as number one, there wouldn't have been a J because a J didn't exist, right? Excuse me? You're going to say that the Sanhedrin, the Romans, listen, Jerusalem, Judea was an occupied territory. There were wars going on, folks. While you're reading these Gospels, right, in the time frame, there are wars taking place by Vespasian. There are tens of thousands of people being slaughtered. You're going to tell me that the Romans would allow a congregation of 5,000 people to meet at one time? That's not going to happen. But getting back to John the Baptist, where would that doctrine have come in? How would it have been acceptable at the first century? Explain that. I often found it odd is that you go out the Gospel of John, right? And I know I'm moving back and forth from the microphone. My nose itches. So Caiaphas, who was the high priest, apparently struck Jesus on the beard, pulled out the beard, the whole story. That never would have happened, by the way. Ask any Jewish rabbi. That would have never happened. And they would have never defiled themselves in such a manner. But anyway, so they're the ones petitioning Pontius Pilate. I ain't the Pontius Pilate in history, by the way. But then you get into the book of Acts, and you have Peter and James standing before the Sanhedrin now. And Caiaphas is acting like, well, who's this Jesus? And the interesting thing about it is, because you get to see Joseph Josephus' DNA all over this. They talk about these other rebel messiahs. So, good book there. And I could go on, but that's what led to my breaking the God spell in my life. Now, this is for me. Not about you. I'm not saying that if you read these books, if you invest in them and read them, you'll come to your own conclusions. But you will see, much to the fact that the stories don't jive. And again, my question is on this. Why would God limit himself to a religion when there's so many? Fact is, he wouldn't. Every religion is man-made, man-conceived, man-implemented, man-written. And that's the truth. Everyone says they have sacred scripture from God. Still, man's writing it. And as any person knows, even a reporter, when he or she writes a story, you're getting a part of that person's inner view, their soul, their reality. They're writing it through their realities. Now, if you start taking everything like that, well, it begins to help put it in a better perspective. Well, I'll be curious to see the comments on this one, but there you go. So where am I at now? Well, I'm on a discovery. I know this. I've become closer to the infinite being than I ever was while I was in a religion belief, because I allowed the religion to dictate the construct of my beliefs. It's what I did. And that's why you have so many different schisms within religions. Not just Christianity, you got them everywhere. Islam has them. Hindu has them. They're everywhere. That's why I'm drawn to the Kabbalah. Listen, did they know God or not? I believe they knew things that we don't. And it's very obvious. When you start reading the Kabbalah, you begin to find it's no different than reading the Gnostics. Because when you start reading the Gnostics, it paints a different picture of the Christ. And again, I was always suspicious as why they took the Hebrewness out of him. Tried to make him Western. And it just never jived. So, interesting show, huh? Be curious to see your comments. All right, everyone. Have yourself a great day. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to yourself in thought, word, and deed. We'll talk soon.